There are several versions of the hiddenness argument by now, and no doubt there'll be more in the future. But I'll focus on the original hiddenness argument, one that I put together when I was at Oxford some 25 years ago. It's probably more than 25 years ago now. And to introduce this argument, I think it'd be good to think about three scenarios. So here's the first scenario. It's one in which God exists and there are no non-believers. That is, God exists and perhaps there are other people too, other persons God has created, finite persons, and if there are, all of them believe that God exists. So that's the first scenario. In that scenario, there's nothing like the hiddenness that's relevant to the hiddenness argument that I want to talk about. The second scenario is one in which God exists, and not everybody is a believer. There are some people who believe, some people who don't believe, but all of those who don't believe fail to believe because they're resisting God in some way. Okay? Relationship with God not on the agenda for them, and they have deceived themselves as to the existence of God. Now they're doubters or disbelievers because of that self-deception. And so all of the non-belief in the world in the second scenario is resistant non-belief. Okay? In that scenario too, there's nothing like the hiddenness that's relevant to the hiddenness argument, because even though God is in a sense hidden from people, it's those people who have hidden God from themselves. It's not as though God has done something intentionally to produce this situation of hiddenness. And now the third scenario is one in which God exists and some people believe in God, some people don't believe in God, with the added wrinkle now that of those who don't believe in God, some are resistant, but some are not. Some who fail to believe in God are in that condition because they've had a good hard look at the evidence, and it's the evidence that causes their non-belief. It's not any kind of resistance to God or to relationship with God that causes their non-belief. And so we would call them non-resistant non-believers. So in that world there are both resistant non-believers and non-resistant non-believers. And now you can take the central claim of the argument as saying something like this, that the first two scenarios are possible if God exists, and the third is impossible. Okay? Could be that everybody believes, or that if some don't believe, and they're in that condition resistantly, that's okay. But if God exists, there will not be any non-resistant non-believers. Okay? So you can take that as the first premise of the core argument, the core of the hiddenness argument. The hiddenness argument, put most simply, would have two premises and a conclusion. That would be the first premise of that core argument. So if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. The second premise, perhaps obviously, is going to be, yeah, there are non-resistant non-believers, from which the conclusion follows, there's no God. Okay, so that's the core hiddenness argument. But now, of course, you're going to want to have some extra premises to support that first premise. Why should we say that if God exists, there won't be any non-resistant non-believers? Well, there's some other thoughts about the hiddenness, about God, more generally, the nature of God, that come into play at this stage. The first premise, first subsidiary premise, if God exists, God is perfectly loving. Okay? We're talking about a personal ultimate, the greatest possible personal being. And this sort of a being we would expect, among other things, to be perfectly loving. So suppose we accept that. If God exists, God is perfectly loving. Next premise, and it's sort of going to go in a chain here. If God exists, God is perfectly loving. If God is perfectly loving, then God is always open to personal relationship, a conscious reciprocal relationship with finite persons. And the third premise, if God is thus open, is open to personal relationship with finite persons, then if anybody fails to believe in God, it's resistantly. It's not going to be non-resistantly. And why is that? Well, that's really the nub, the heart of the matter, the connection between openness and the absence of non-resistant non-belief. If God is open in the sense in which I intend, it's a very minimal sense. All I mean is that God isn't closed to this sort of relationship. It's never going to be the case that God does something to prevent people from being able to enter into personal relationship with God, participating in relationship with God. So they might still not participate in relationship with God, but if so, it's going to be because of what they've done, not because of anything God's done. So that's what's meant by openness. And now think about what's required to be able to participate in a relationship with God just by trying to. And notice when I say just by trying to, it makes it sound as though it might be easy to do this, but it could very well be hard. It could be that, you can, just by trying in the right way, enter into relationship with God, but it might not be pleasant, it might not be easy, okay? But that's what I mean when I'm talking about being in a position of the sort that if God is open to relationship, God will put people in, okay, that position. Now, to be in that position, you have to believe that God exists. It's a very simple idea, really, to be able to relate personally in this way, to be in a conscious reciprocal relationship with somebody else, it doesn't matter who it is. You have to believe that they exist. And so God would, if God is thus open, make it possible for people to believe that God exists. And again, it could be that they fail to believe, but if so, it's only going to be if they have arrived at that state themselves through resisting relationship with God in some way. And so that's why you get to that main premise of the core argument: if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. All right, so that's the core argument, 2 premises and a conclusion. A number of other premises can be brought into play which jointly entail that first premise. So that's the hiddenness argument. Those are some of the main, most important premises. Various objections are possible and have been made. Plenty have been made. You can sort of map them onto the premises of the core argument. Of course, there are some subsidiary premises now too that we've mentioned. So an objection could be made to any of those. And here are some main ways of responding that we've seen so far. You might first of all object, and a lot of people in the first years of the discussion of the hiddenness argument did object to the premise 2 of the core argument, which says there is non-resistant non-belief, or that there are non-resistant non-believers. And there were people who were inclined to say, well, how can we be so sure of that? Peter Van Inwagen, in a session we were at together, he was putting that point to me and saying, yeah, it looks like we could be resistant without even perhaps being aware of it. There could be hidden resistance, and we're human beings, finite, imperfect beings. We're thinking about a perfect, morally demanding God, Shouldn't we expect that people might be a little reluctant to believe in such a God because of all the moral demands that might come with it, that sort of thing? So there could be hidden resistance. So that's sort of an argument. It doesn't have to claim that we know that everybody who seems to be a non-resistant non-believer really is a resistant non-believer. But how can we rule it out? How can we be sure that there are non-resistant non-believers? And even if all we have to say is that we should be in doubt about that premise, that would already put that premise out of action, philosophically speaking. So that's one objection, or one kind of objection that could be made, the hidden resistance objection, we might call it. A second way of objecting to the argument would be with respect to the idea of openness always. Okay? The argument says God would, if loving, always be open to personal relationship with finite creatures. And people sometimes get hung up on that word always and say, well, why should we suppose that God would always be open? That seems a little extravagant. What if God were temporarily non-open? Or what if that sort of openness to relationship were postponed until the afterlife or something like that? Why should we think that God is any less good or less perfect, less loving, and so on? So that would be another way of responding to the argument. And it's a way that has been used, for example, by the philosopher William Wainwright. Then there's a third way. This is the one that has been used most of all. There are many, many examples of this sort of objection to the hiddenness argument. It's now an objection again to the first premise, which says if God exists, God's going to see to it that there are no non-resistant non-believers. On this objection, even if other things being equal, God would always be open. It is other things being equal, and things are not equal. In fact, there are special reasons why God might for a time not be open to relationship. And they might have something to do specifically with belief and how belief functions, or non-belief. Something having the result that God would for some time not be open to relationship. And so there are various reasons that have been put forward. I'll just mention 2. And they're really broadly of the same kind, a moral kind. Some of the most interesting reasons that have been put forward have been broadly moral. Okay? So somebody might say, and this has been said by Michael Murray, for example, and Richard Swinburne, that people who are to be free, and of course the thing that's being valued now, the reason that's being put forward, is to do with moral freedom, the value of moral freedom. People who are morally free have to have at least some impulse to do what is wrong, to do bad things, okay? But if everybody believed in God, okay, a perfect being who is in a very good position to punish you if you do something wrong, right? Or maybe to reward you. You don't have to be so negative and emphasize punishment. Maybe to reward you when you do well, when you do good. What incentive would there be to do what is wrong? And even if for some people there would still be that incentive, they'd still have a strong desire to do what's wrong, there might also be some people, and we should expect that there would be some people who are so sensitive, so impressionable, as it were, okay? That for them, even if not for others, at least for them, it would be hard to do what is wrong. It would be easy to do what is right. And so there's a kind of freedom that's taken away from them. They are no longer free to do what is wrong. Okay? So that's a kind of moral freedom argument. And even if it's only for some people for some time, that's all that's needed in order to put the hiddenness argument out of action. That's the claim. There's another, also an interesting way of using moral considerations to try to resist the hiddenness argument. This is a move that was put forward by Andrew Cullison, and he says that there's something peculiarly admirable about somebody who doesn't believe in God doing something self-sacrificial, for example, sacrificing one's life. Okay? We all admire this when it happens, you know, somebody who has the courage to sacrifice their life for some great noble cause, or to save the life of somebody else. There's something really noble about somebody who doesn't believe in God, who has no thought of any kind of reward for this, no thought of an afterlife. The sacrifice just seems to be more impressive. And that's just taken away if everybody believes in God. This kind of move, I kind of like this move because if it works at all, it would have quite a wide effect. It would be good for lots and lots of people, perhaps, not to believe in God if this kind of point has any significant force. So that too is a moral reason that might be used to say, well, even if other things being equal, God would be always open to relationship with finite persons. There are these special reasons why, at least for some time, God might not be. These are some examples. Okay, so you have those three types of objections. Yeah, I think most objections could be mapped in, you know, onto one of those three types. Well, yeah, there are ways of responding to all of these objections. It's not as though, you know, a number of objections are put forward and now we all have to fold our tents and slink silently away. There's a way of responding that hiddenness arguer can use in each case. So how would we respond to the first of the three objections or objection types that I mentioned, the hidden resistance argument? Well, an interesting feature of that objection is that if it has any force at all, it really has very wide applicability. It applies across categories of believers and non-believers. In fact, Peter van Inwagen, in the very discussion I alluded to, was inclined to say that he himself, you know, as a believer, had all kinds of hidden resistance, no doubt, to the demands of God. Well, but then, you know, if it's the kind of thing that even believers feel, why should we focus on this as the cause specifically of what looks like non-resistant non-belief? Okay, we need something that's going to be plausibly viewed as a cause, in this case, you know, a resistant cause of non-belief. And especially when you have examples of people, at least some people, among those who appear to be non-resistant non-believers, who they really don't look like they're resisting God. They may, in fact, be former believers. Take former believers, for example. People who used to believe in God, and they've been worn down. They don't want to be. They want to continue believing in God. They may still be part of a moral community. They may, in fact, continue to impose on themselves, you know, significant moral demands. So many of the things that the hidden resistance sort of argument appeals to don't even apply to them. You'd need some sort of theological background assumption to be able to press the point any further beyond that stage. And of course, you know, we're doing philosophy here. When the hiddenness argument is put forward, it's in a philosophical context, and we should be able to refute it, if at all, with philosophical considerations. But another really important point that has been overlooked quite a lot, I think it's finally sinking in though, and that's why this kind of argument isn't made very much anymore. It's that non-resistant non-believers come in many different forms and have appeared at many different times. That's the important thing. It's not only people right now who are in doubt or who disbelieve and who have thought about the evidence and now have to somehow back that up, that it's really because they're looking at the evidence that they're non-believers. No, it's also people who existed long ago in the history of evolution. We've had members of our species who existed long before theistic traditions arose, long before people were even able to really look squarely in the face of this concept of a God distinct from nature, who has created the world, who's created us, who has all power, all knowledge, all goodness, all love, and is inviting us into a relationship and so on. There have been lots of people in the past who just didn't even have that concept. Are they non-believers? Clearly so. They don't have the belief that God exists. Are they non-resistant non-believers? Clearly so, because they can't so much as frame the idea for themselves, and so how could they be resistant, all right? So here you see how it's so important that we notice how the argument, as it were, moves from above, not from below. It's moving from reflection on the nature of God, and it allows the problematic consideration to emerge from that reflection. So when thinking about the nature of God, you gradually get to see that it's non-resistant non-belief in whatever form it takes that's problematic, and that's why we can now use that to respond to this sort of hidden resistance objection. When we notice that the category of non-resistant non-believers includes these people who exist as it were pre-doubt or pre-disbelief, we see that that objection really has no force at all. So that's, I think, an adequate response to the first sort of objection. The second one, which says that saying that God has to always be open to relationship with us, you know, isn't that sort of demanding or extravagant? Well, we're talking about perfect love here. We're thinking about a being who is unsurpassably loving. And so when we think about beings in our own experience, people we know whom we think of as loving us, all right, and it's in these human relationships of love that our concept of love emerges and gets the meaning that it has, that we use when we apply it to God. When we think in these ordinary contexts, I mean, can you imagine somebody of whom you would say that she really loves you? Can you imagine somebody like that who isn't always open to relationship with you in the minimal sense that I've described, you know, not being closed? Can you imagine somebody who loves you but is closed to relationship with you? That should strike us as pretty odd, it seems to me. Now, it might be that at some earlier time we were willing to let people get away with different sorts of behavior than today. After some cultural evolution, we're inclined to do. I mean, we've come to see that love has these relational implications. Okay, it used to be perhaps that you could be at some distance from someone and still be thought of as loving because, you know, you have benevolent inclinations towards them. I think there are all kinds of things that come into play here. For example, the way in which in the history of God talk there's been a tendency to think of God in masculine terms, think of God as Father, and so on. And in the not too distant past, we were inclined to allow males and fathers to be somewhat distant, all right? But if we think about what we have reason to believe about the nature of love, right now, trying to avoid the influence of those sorts of factors, won't we say that somebody who loves you is going to be open to relationship with you so long as it's possible to absorb the consequences of that sort of openness, and bringing those consequences into harmony with the flourishing of the various parties to this relationship and the relationship itself. There's a kind of principle there. I call it the openness principle, and I've just enunciated it. Let me say it again. If A loves B, okay, then A will be open to this kind of relationship with B insofar as A is able to accommodate the consequences of such openness, bringing them into conformity with the flourishing of both A and B, and of any relationship that might come to exist between them. Now, you say to me, aha, you've put a qualifier on openness, and indeed I have. And there are some odd situations in human life where perhaps it's not the case that A is able to accommodate all the consequences of openness. If somebody, for example, gives up her child for adoption because she thinks she's not a fit parent, or he thinks he's not a fit parent, or whatever it might be. Could be that you'd want to say, well, she still loves, or he still loves this person even though no longer, but it's again because they're unable to accommodate the consequences of openness. And when you think about God, that's not going to be a consideration. God is in so much better a position to accommodate all the consequences. So when we apply that openness principle thinking about God, we're not going to have the kind of result we have with human beings. All right, so I've been talking about how we might respond to the objection that we shouldn't think that God, if loving, is going to be always open to relationship with us. And I've so far got at least to the point where you might be inclined to say, well, other things being equal, so long as God can absorb the consequences, God will be. So that would be enough to take care of the second objection, but it sets us up for the third one, right? Which says, oh, but there could be special reasons. Special reasons leading even God to be temporarily non-open to relationship, temporarily to allow non-belief, perhaps because of some great good that couldn't otherwise be achieved. Okay? And so now we come back into the vicinity of those moral arguments we were talking about a little bit earlier. So how can we respond to this? How can we apply the openness principle here? Well, one thing we can do is we can think about how God, being God, is able to produce goods of the same type without sacrificing openness to relationship. Okay? So if you think that so long as God is able to accommodate the consequences and is able to, as part of that, produce goods that are of the same type as the goods that are said to require hiddenness, well, then we shouldn't expect God to retreat, to not be open to relationship with us. So what about that first one of moral freedom? Well, you can think of moral freedom as a type of good, and there are many, many different ways of tokening that type, many different sorts of moral freedom. Imagine that there really are people who are as impressionable and as sensitive as we were talking about earlier, who would find it difficult to do what is wrong if they believed that God exists, who can punish or reward them for either doing what is wrong or resisting that urge. Suppose that there are people like this. I mean, there's a question about why there should be people like that. And you might have, the person who's responding to the hiddenness argument will sometimes be extrapolating from what we see around us, but that assumes that if God exists, God's going to create us, or people like us, and why suppose that, right? But suppose we go along with that assumption and say there will be at least some people like that. So we grant that they're not able to, they're not free to choose to do what is wrong. But there are all kinds of ways of exercising moral freedom. You might still have the opportunity to choose to do the kinds of actions that philosophers call supererogatory, actions that are above and beyond the call of duty, okay? Actions that aren't required of you, and so the same sorts of considerations wouldn't apply, right? You wouldn't be thinking, well, I got to do this or God's going to punish me. No, it's not an obligation, so it's not the same kind of thing. So I have a choice, I still have a choice, even if I'm one of those shrinking violets we were talking about. I still have a choice whether I'm going to pursue great, great noble goods, right? Supererogatory goods, making something really special and noble of myself, or, you know, sink into the couch. I still have that kind of choice between that sort of moral virtue and moral mediocrity, you might say. So that's moral freedom. So why isn't that something that would substitute for the kind of freedom that is allegedly, or that we're assuming is taken away by God not being hidden? But how about that other moral argument, Andrew Cullison's argument about self-sacrifice? That's an interesting argument, as I said. And in fact, it refers to a kind of supererogatory action that we greatly admire. Okay? And the idea is, well, we just can't really do that. But what's so admirable about that sort of action? Presumably it's got a lot to do with the courage that is evinced when somebody does that sort of action. When you sacrifice yourself, sacrifice your life, and you're not doing it just, impulsively in the way that some people apparently do this without thinking, but you choose, you exercise great courage in giving up your life for the sake of some great good, maybe the life of another. Well, it could very well be that the kind of fear that would cancel courage or diminish the kind of courage that can be exhibited, it could be that that fear would be made irrational by belief in God. But it's another thing to say that it would just be absent because of your belief in God. Fear, as human beings, let's suppose we're talking about beings that are somewhat like us. That's what the objection has got us doing. So we're thinking about being somewhat like us. We have very powerful self-preservation instincts. And those we should expect still to be mobilized, still to be causing fear, even if you believe that God exists. I'm not sure I can see how fear would be that greatly diminished. And so I can't see that there'd be a significant difference between somebody who does that sort of action, between the kind of courage it's called for, doing that sort of action reflectively, not believing in God, and somebody doing it who does believe in God. Something else to remember in this neighborhood that will help to make that point persuasive is that when we think about believing in God, we must be careful to realize we're just talking about belief in God. We're not talking about a sense of God's experiential presence. People will sometimes conflate those two. I've seen that over and over again. And so it could be that if somebody has this reassuring sense of God's presence, right, in the moment when they make a very difficult choice, that choice is actually not going to be that difficult. Okay, it could be that, they're just sort of rolling along, and in this powerful sense of God's presence, they can do anything. Okay, all right, maybe that's the case. Suppose that's the case. That's a very different scenario from which somebody simply believes that there's a God, just has that extra intellectual item. Believing that there is a God, as the Hedonist argument tells us, they're able to do all kinds of things, entering into relationship with God, if there is indeed a God. But I don't think that it has the power to prevent somebody from requiring courage to sacrifice a life. And if we think it does, we may be conflating belief with a sense of God's experiential presence. So that's at least an initial response. There's much more in the literature, but an initial response to the three types of objection we talked about earlier. All right, there are two parts to this question, so let me take them one at a time. My view of the relation between religion and science, big question, but I do think I may have a novel view on that relationship, which makes time much more centrally important than it is in many other discussions of science and religion. And in fact, it's sort of ironic because it's science itself that generates the view on time that I'm referring to. It's deep time, the idea of scientific time, geological time, where the periods that we have to try to get our heads around are so much greater than anything that we encounter on human timescales. I mean, human timescales, we're thinking about minutes, hours, years, centuries already start to tax our imagination, millennium, but that's just a drop in the bucket when it comes to scientific time, where we have to get familiar with thinking about millions of years and even billions of years, and we really don't do a very good job of that. Nonetheless, that's what science has given us. One of the results of scientific investigation is deep time. Okay, I tend to think that the metaphor deep must have come from somebody looking into a bottomless well. It's something like that when you think about the deep past, billions of years, or when you look forward, as we too rarely do, into the deep future. So time. Now, how does that change how we should think about religion and science? Well, then we have to sort of find our place in time. And here we are at a very early stage, given scientific timescales, at a very early stage of the life of science and of religion, okay, just a few thousand years. Now you might say, science has made considerable headway in those few thousand years. I suppose that's true. Science has developed very sophisticated methodologies for pursuing its goals. And you might even say, I'd be prepared to say that as far as its ability to do its thing is concerned, science has done better so far than religion. Okay? So suppose we agree that religion is behind in terms of doing its own thing and doing it conspicuously well. Okay? Science does its thing, the investigation of nature, putting it broadly, conspicuously well. It's not so obvious that that's the case for religion. We have disagreement about even the most fundamental matters in religion, whereas it's not the case in science. It's one example of a relevant difference. Okay, so science is ahead, but this is a relative difference. And when you think about it within the context of deep time, who knows where things are going to go from here? We can start to notice, within the context of deep time, the gift of science, we can start to notice that we're still at an extremely early stage. It would be remarkable indeed if we had exhausted the study of nature. It could be that in order to really get even a full scientific understanding, we're going to need to continue scientific inquiry for an enormously long period of time, periods of time that would tax our imagination. Suppose that that's at least possible. I think you can make it at least possible. In that case, we have to say we don't know where things are going to go in the future. So even if now science is ahead of religion, who knows where religion is going to be in the future? Okay? Perhaps religion right now is something like science, what, 1,000, 1,500 years ago? Okay? Science has made a lot of progress. So what stage are we at? So when we think about things temporally in this way, we can think about stages of development. Okay? So my view on science and religion incorporates that sort of thinking, that sort of temporally inflected thinking. Stages of development. Science is ahead of religion, but who knows where things are going to go in the future. It could be that religion is going to make a lot more progress, is going to be able to provide much more persuasive evidence that there is more to reality than just the sort of thing that science can deal with. And so we end up with a view, perhaps, which incorporates elements both from science and from religion. Okay? At least it's a possibility. Like any good philosopher, I want to ask, scientific worldview can mean different things. If by scientific worldview you mean a naturalistic worldview, and here I mean the view that metaphysical naturalism is true, that nature is all there is, putting it roughly, that nature is, there's just one single system that constitutes reality. It's a natural system, the kind of thing that science can explore. Suppose you hold that view, the view that nature is all there is, and suppose that that's what you mean when you speak of a scientific worldview. I think a lot of people do that. They conflate a scientific worldview and naturalism. Well, if that's what you mean, then of course you're rationally obligated to be an atheist, because atheism follows deductively from naturalism, right? Because if nature is all there is, well, then there's no God. It just follows deductively. So in that sense, we'd have to say yes, but I don't think that's the sense of the term scientific worldview that we should be working with. We need something that we could plausibly use when saying that everyone should have a scientific worldview. And I don't think it's clear at all that everyone should be a naturalist. So what does it mean then? What might it mean instead? It could mean something like this, that your worldview is one that is sensitive to and respectful of the best results of science. Maybe incorporates the best results of science. Okay? Maybe that's enough to count as having a scientific worldview. And so if you're inclined to believe something, it turns out that it's contradicted by some of the best results of science, well, that would be a conclusive reason for you not to believe it. Okay? Maybe that would be an implication. All right, so suppose we take scientific worldview in that sense. Then I would say, no, you're not rationally committed by virtue of having a scientific worldview alone to be an atheist or an agnostic. Because we can imagine, for example, somebody who accepts the existence of God on philosophical grounds. They have a very philosophically sophisticated theism. And the kind of theism that they've developed is one that involves the claim that God, the being they hold to exist as a theist, has created, is at least the source in some sense of the very world that science investigates and is gradually exposing to us. So it's an evolutionary world, fine. The understanding of God they have is quite compatible with that. I don't see why that's not a possibility. I think that there could be, probably are, people like that. People who have that sort of theism. And I think they could very well be people who have a scientific worldview in the sense in which we're now considering. Yeah, an interesting question. I'm a philosopher, so maybe you're expecting me to now, denounce what these people are saying, because they're saying that philosophy doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether we should be atheists or not, which would of course make the hiddenness argument completely irrelevant. It's a philosophical argument, not a scientific argument, right? So how should we respond to this attitude? Well, I think most charitably, I'm a Canadian, so I'm naturally inclined to be charitable right at the start. Most charitably, we might take their view as involving the idea that theism is a fairly detailed and dense claim. It includes, among other things, the idea that God has created and designed the world in a manner that is incompatible with some things that science claims, for example, evolution. So maybe they take theism to entail creationism, the idea, special creationism, the idea that God has specially created in a very short period of time everything that exists in the world. Now, if that's what theism were, as you can see, I'm going to say it's not, but if that's what it were, if that's what we take theism to be, then clearly we're going to say that we have conclusive scientific reasons to deny theism, to be atheists, all right? So we don't need philosophy, right? Because we can see that theism entails claims which science has conclusively falsified. But, okay, here ends my charity, that's not what theism is for anybody who's spent any time seriously thinking about studying issues about belief in God. Now, I mean, clearly there's some theists who hold that view, but that's a view that includes a whole lot more than just straight theism. You could be a straight theist believing in God, the creator of the universe, being that has all power, all knowledge, all goodness, and love, and you could pack into it all kinds of subtle philosophical content, and a lot of people do. And now you've got a conception of God that clearly requires some kind of philosophical response, some kind of philosophical analysis, first of all, so we can understand what's being claimed, philosophical arguments back and forth to see whether there's any good reason to think that such a being exists. Science might have some role to play, but it wouldn't all by itself be usable as a way of showing that this claim is false. Now, some of the people that are mentioned here, I expect some of these scientists who say that philosophy doesn't have much value are inclined to say they're not terribly interested in that idea of God. Okay? And I think now they show their true colors, because I myself am inclined to think that these people, at least on matters of religion, are not thinkers. We shouldn't construe them as thinkers. They are activists. These are people who see how a certain form of religion, that sort of creationist religion I was talking about earlier, special design and so on, and the belief in that sort of religion on the part of many people, especially in parts of North America, Europe too, stands in the way of the progress of science. Okay? And these are people who are really, really frustrated at how, for example, belief in evolution doesn't just spread around the world, right? And they would like to make that possible, and so they naturally are inclined to resist this sort of belief. This is what they're interested in, this kind of belief. As activists, they want to get rid of this kind of belief. And of course, to do that, all that you really should need is science. But if we're thinking about theism, and we're not just activists, we want to be taken seriously as thinkers on the matter, then immediately we're going to bump into issues about which only philosophy can really illuminate us, potentially. For example, for that more sophisticated idea of God that I was saying somebody might develop, how are you going to refute that using science? What's your best bet? Well, it's going to be something like this: using science, the progress, the great success of science, to support the view that I've called naturalism, metaphysical naturalism, okay? To argue that given the success of science, we should be naturalists. Naturalism entails atheism, and so we should be atheists. But now notice what you've done. You've started doing philosophy, okay? So it seems to me there's a kind of dilemma here. Either you're people like this, either they're going to be activists or thinkers, okay? You have to decide. It's fine to be activists, you know, I'll jump on that bandwagon. But if they want to be taken seriously as thinkers, immediately for any discerning person, they're going to have to take philosophy seriously. And in fact, you're going to have to do philosophy. So that's at least an initial response to this question.